Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of On the Mark TV and Radio here at Westfield Community Programming Channel 15, 89.5 FM WSKB, and our media partners at Southwick Community Programming. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach, and we launch a new season of On the Mark today. My first guest is Chris Landry, who has been a colleague of mine for, I want to say, decades now, but Chris got his start in advancement and fundraising at the Children's Museum of Holyoke, and later on at historic Deerfield and the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. And through his advancement work, became a very adept storyteller. And he moved off on his own to start his own communications company. And he tells the stories of many people who are doing extraordinary things, both through print and through broadcast and film. So, Chris, it's been a long time, but it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Mark. It's been too long.
Way too long. So you made this big pivot a few years ago from raising money for organizations to telling their stories. And hopefully those stories would either create awareness or raise money and all of that. What made you decide to pivot and become a filmmaker telling other people's stories?
Well, back when I was Director of Development at the Food Bank of Western Mass, I really got to understand in a really deep way the power of effective storytelling. You can have all the statistics, all the data you want, but when you tell the story of one person or one community, that's when you really touch the hearts and the minds of people, whether they're donors or decision makers, politicians, you name it. So I just realized that was kind of what I like to do. It became fun to do that. And yeah, it's what I do all the time now.
What are some of the stories that you've been able to tell and some of the people that you've been able to introduce to a larger public?
Well, for the last several years, I've been working with folks in Alaska, a statewide salmon protection group, and several Alaska Native organizations. And they're having a lot of challenges. Climate change is accelerated at the poles. So the further north you go or the south, the faster it's getting warm. So that's affecting the salmon. It's affecting the permafrost. And so complicated ecosystem stories, but also communities trying to protect their ways of life from mines and oil and gas exploration and so on. So we've been working with them for several years. And in fact, I just got back from the Yukon River. We spent 2 weeks up there. My son was with me running the cameras, and we had an incredible time there.
So you've really, this whole storytelling venture that you got into has really taken you all around the world.
It has. We've been to Central America doing stories and across the U.S. And yeah, I've met extraordinary people, and mostly it's regular, everyday people who are putting themselves on the line to really defend their land, their communities, and work for a better world. And it's been very inspiring. Every time I go out on the road, I meet amazing people.
How do these stories find you, or do you find the stories?
Well, it's some of both. Some of it is through my relationships with several foundations. I work with a couple of foundations who are providing climate funding and democracy funding, for example. So sometimes the foundations will come to me and ask me to work with one of their organizations. Sometimes I hear directly from the organizations. And so it's kind of a combination.
Now, when you're traveling halfway around the world to do a story and to film it, how do you get the research down before you go so you make the most of your filming time? Or do you go and do the research while you're on site?
Well, in film production, the pre-production phase, as we call it, the planning phase, is really the most critical part of it. You're not going to have a successful project without really getting clear on what the goals are, what the story is. And so I will work with local partners and collaborators long in advance. We'll have calls and documents where we're trying to get the story straight. And then sometimes I'll do Zoom calls with some of the folks that we're going to interview. So we get to know each other in advance, and I get a sense of who they are, what their story is, and how it fits into the bigger story.
How difficult is it? How much of a crew do you have to take when you go, for example, to the Yukon, and how much equipment do you tote into the tundra?
Yeah, well, that was really a challenge because we were flying on bush planes and they have weight limits. And so we traded out, we bought some new lightweight tripods and light stands. We brought lighter lights, but we still had two cameras, half a dozen lenses maybe, and we had over 100 pounds of gear and a crew of two. And lately, my son Ben, my oldest son Ben, has been working with me. Both my boys have learned film and video production. In fact, Dylan has a film in the New Haven Film Festival in October. And Ben came along and he was operating the cameras and lights. So we travel light. We have a much smaller crew than typically you'll see because we're working on relatively small budgets with good organizations, and we're trying to make the most of it.
So, in this Yukon thing, how long were you actually filming, and then how long will you go into post production before the final product of the final story is out there?
We were there for 2 weeks, and we were mostly in two small native villages. And on the Yukon River, they've been fishing for salmon for over 12,000 years. There's archaeological evidence that goes back that far. For the last 3 years, they haven't been allowed to take any salmon because of population. The salmon population is in decline, but it's a complicated story, including commercial trawlers off the coast. So we spent 2 weeks there. We spent a lot of time on boats. We did a number of interviews, and we'll spend a good part of the fall doing post-production, and we'll make several pieces. We'll be making some relatively short pieces that these organizations can use on social media, and then we'll be making a longer film to submit to film festivals because we want to raise awareness in the lower 48 about what's happening there.
Now, you as a filmmaker could be working anywhere in a major city like New York or LA, but you chose to do this in Western Massachusetts. What was the rationale behind that, and what was the reasoning?
That's a great question. I mean, this is where I live. This is where my kids were born, and this is where my community is. And the reality is that you don't need to be in New York or LA to do important work. And so most of it's virtual in terms of the meetings and the planning. And then we just fly or sometimes drive if we're lucky to where the story is. So for me, it works. I live out in the hill towns, and my dog and I walk in the woods. We walk along the rivers, and it's kind of a nice mix.
And what got you here to the Valley in the first place?
Well, it's been so long I can hardly remember. But we came here, my ex-wife and I did, for graduate school, and soon developed a community of friends and found useful work. And it's been home ever since. I call it, I grew up near Boston, and I tell folks back east that this is the beautiful part of the state. This is really where it's just the quality of life is nicer. It's more relaxed. People have a little bit more time, and the drivers are not as angry.
That is definitely true. And what I find interesting, Chris, in the work that I do, and our lives sort of parallel each other telling people's stories, the fact that there are so many creative people here in Western Massachusetts that float under the radar, so to speak. They're not, you don't read about them every day in the film magazines or Variety or things like that, but the quality of what gets produced here, whether it's a feature film for the showcase, for the cinemas or film festival or documentary or whatever, the quality and the quantity of film coming out of Western Massachusetts is absolutely extraordinary.
It really is. And, that's the thing, is that I can call up my friend Zach McDonald, for example, who's also worked around the world, very talented cinematographer and editor. And, I will bring him onto a project, or I'll call someone else up, and there's audio experts and there's graphics people. It's really an amazing talent pool here. It is one of our secrets in Western Massachusetts.
Do you have your own studio or to edit and all of that, or do you have to go find studio space here?
When the first piece I ever did was I was involved in a public access TV show in Holyoke many years ago, and we were in a big room with big clunky decks and VHS tape copying from one machine to the other. And now it's all done on laptops or desktop computers. So I have my office here at home, and it works really well.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, did the pandemic change how you did your work, or were you already adept at working from home and doing the Zoom calls and all of that?
I was working at home for several years before that, and sometimes getting out to a coffee shop to work at times. The pandemic took that away for the most part, at least for a while. Um, so yeah, I'm used to that balance of spending time on my own, working from home, and then also getting on the road and meeting people and working with collaborators, smart people all over the place.
Yeah, I find that I put a studio in the house to do radio and some of the other things before the pandemic, the year before, and kind of built it up. And so the pandemic didn't impact my work particularly. I did come in here to the studio to do radio because we have a way of isolating our people so that there's not a lot of traffic coming in and out of the particular studios. But I thrived during the pandemic. It did not slow me down or stop my workflow, even though a couple of my clients went under or went on hiatus. For me personally, getting out there to tell people stories never stopped.
Yeah, that's great. And I had the same experience. I will say in March of 2020, I had a full calendar of travel, film related travel, um, and it all disappeared almost overnight. Um, and I just thought, I, let's see what happens. And it turned out to be my best year ever. Projects came, different kinds of projects came. I helped write a book for a client. We did some other things, continued to do the film work, but in different ways. Um, and I'm finding that organizations really are understanding the need to tell their stories. So there is work, and it's important work, and yeah, it's very satisfying.
Yeah, and how many projects can you be working on at once? Are you a good juggler, or do you go from one to the next?
I'm not a good juggler, but nonetheless, I'm always juggling
Yeah.
projects. I don't know how many I have going on right now, probably five or six, and they're in different stages of production. Some are near the end. We've been working on a documentary film about uh, a pipeline that was to have gone through West Virginia, Virginia into North Carolina. Would have been a 600-mile pipeline um, through some of the most beautiful land in the country, national forests, the Shenandoah Valley, all of that. Um, and regular people stood up and said, no, this pipeline's not necessary. It's not benefiting us. This is purely something for corporate profit. And they spent 6 years fighting it and won. So that one we've basically finished the filming, and now we're in editing mode. And then there are others that are just in the planning mode. So it works. I probably should have some more help to keep all the balls in the air, but it's going pretty well.
And do you have? I know that your sons work with you, and you job in other, videographers and talent and things like that. But are you really a solo proprietor, or do you have a shop with other people?
I'm a solo operation. I don't have any paid employees. I have really wonderful people I bring in depending on what the client needs. So that could be copywriters, graphic designers, camera operators or editors, and so on. So, I realized when I started my business 10 or 11 years ago, I wanted to just keep it so that I could balance work and life and not have to be worrying about payroll and all of that. So I like it this way. I chose not to grow into an agency model. And I find it very satisfying. I'm working directly with the clients and I'm going out. Sometimes I'll send a crew out to do an interview, but typically I'm going out and meeting because I know the story well. I know what we need to get, and I find that very satisfying.
I'm sort of in the same boat with you. I job people in depending on the particular project that we're working on, but I've basically been a solo practitioner for close to 30 years, which mind boggles me sometimes. But, I don't know for you, but for me, my job changes every day, depending on the project that I'm working on. I never get bored, and I don't think I could ever stop.
Right, exactly. I mean, really, we ought to join forces and take over the world, but that might be too much for people to handle if we were working together.
Not only that, but as I get older, I get lazier, and I like breaks from routine. One of the things I learned to do, Chris, about 3 years ago, I was in a horrific accident, and it took me 6 months to learn to walk again. And so I had to farm things out. And when I came back to the workplace full tilt, it was maybe 7 or 8 months before the pandemic. I learned to take time off for myself to just regroup and refresh. And in fact, coming back into the studio this week after 2 weeks off where I did nothing. I watched no movies. I watched no news programs on TV. I just lay out in the sun during the day and shivered in air conditioning at night. But, I'm one of those, I can keep going forever as long as I get these little breaks in my, time to recharge.
Yeah, that's important. And it did take me some time to realize that some days there's not a lot that I need to do. I'm waiting for a client to review something. I'm waiting for someone else to do something. I'm waiting to hear from this person. And it took me a long time to realize, I could just go work in the yard and not feel guilty during the middle of the day. And that's really the nice thing is that it does allow for some balance. I tell people my boss isn't very good, but he's easy to work for. So, it works for me.
Yeah, and I tell myself my boss is a pushover, so if I can intrigue myself, that if there's a reason to do something that I think is good, the boss is going to buy into the project.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So it is fun.
Well, Chris, we're going to take a quick break here to acknowledge the underwriters that make On the Mark and other programming here at Westfield Community Programming and 89.5 FM WSKB, a reality. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. We'll be back after these messages, so don't go away.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Westfield Bank. For more than 160 years, Westfield Bank has been an important community presence and commercial leader in the Pioneer Valley. With convenient full banking services in Westfield, West Springfield, East Longmeadow, Agawam, Feeding Hills, Springfield, Southwick, as well as Enfield and Granby, Connecticut, visit us on the web at westfieldbank.org.
Underwriting for WSKB's community radio programming is brought to you in part by R. Levesque Associates. They are offering landscape architecture, civil engineering, environmental permitting, and land surveying. RLA is a second-generation company devoted to excellence in the planning and design of outdoor spaces. On the web at rlaland.com or at 40 School Street in Westfield.
Join me, Tina Gorman, each week from 6 to 8 a.m. for Wake Up Wednesday, when my guests and I discuss health, wellness, and lifestyle reimagined.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB. Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 at 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. If you've missed a part of today's program, or you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, it's archived along with all the other On the Mark, Athenaeum Spotlight, Arts Beat programs on YouTube at WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. My guest this first half hour is Chris Landry, who, as a communicator and a storyteller, does a lot of filmmaking for his clients, brochures, all the way of helping a client with a cause tell a great story. Chris, you started out as in advancement and as a fundraiser, which is not a career that people generally start in. How did you get? I mean, we first met. You were at the Children's Museum of Holyoke.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get? How did you get into that role as a fundraiser, and then move on to Deerfield, historic Deerfield, and then the food bank?
Well, it was kind of accidental. I was actually my job at the Children's Museum way back when I was a young man was working on the exhibits and programs, and I ended up writing a lot of grants just because we needed the resources. And I found that I had a pretty good success rate. I went on to do it for a couple of other organizations. My work at the food bank in Western Mass was really gratifying, had a wonderful team, a great staff, and really an incredible network of food pantries and soup kitchens and shelters that we were working with across the region. I loved it. We had the food bank's first capital campaign during that time. Now, of course, they're working on another one, and it was a great experience. Not something I ever intended to do, but it was something that I found I had a skill for and enjoyed.
Because I remember being a part of a project that you put together, and I can't remember, but we had a steering committee on a media element for it, and you brought me in to do that. And you had the best media people in the Valley working with you, and it didn't seem like it was work. It seemed more like a coffee clutch every time we would meet on early in the morning, and so much work and so much vision would get done.
Well, that was the media folks who were advising us on the capital campaign for the food bank. And you're right, we had wonderful people. And that's because really of the reputation that the food bank had, that there were very few times when we'd ask someone to help and they would say no. People always wanted to pitch in and help. And yeah, we had wonderful people involved.
Yeah. How did you learn the art of filmmaking? Were you self-taught, or did you go to school to learn it, or apprentice with other people?
I didn't go to school for it. I had have a collaborator and a friend who was originally based in North Carolina. Now they're in the DC area. And I worked with them for several years. I would bring them in for my client projects. I learned more and more. And my friend Colby from this firm was a natural teacher and loved teaching and giving feedback. And I learned slowly, took a lot of classes, online kinds of things. But really, it's the kind of thing that you learn by doing. And, like anything, you look back on the early work and you think, oh, well, that could have been better. I see what was wrong here. So part of it is really just paying attention, watching a lot of documentaries, taking notes, seeing what you like, and really trial and error.
Since you've been a storyteller now through the art of film and motion picture for this period of time, what makes a good story?
Well, a good story is when you have an authentic individual and they're willing to open up and be vulnerable. Eastern Kentucky right now is suffering. They had flash floods that destroyed over 1,000 homes, took some lives. It set them back. And I was down there several times working with organizations there to tell their stories about how they're trying to build a post-coal economy. And you just sometimes never know what's going to happen when you sit down with someone. But I'm thinking, for example, of a retired coal miner uh, who became an environmental activist. He talked about how coal was good for this country, helped us win the two world wars, but how he didn't want his grandchildren to have to live the way that he did and do that work and have the health consequences and have the environmental consequences. So he got involved in community solar and things like that. So someone like that, absolutely authentic and genuine human being who saw how things were and he wanted to do it differently. And that was a beautiful story.
And were your eyes opened up when you go to do a story like this? You must have had preconceptions based upon your experience in setting the project up or in what you've read or seen. But do your eyes get open to new realities every time you go out on a film project?
Absolutely. It's always a learning experience. And, to me, when someone sits down and is telling their story, it's a gift and it's kind of a sacred moment. It's really, they're opening up and becoming vulnerable. And more times than not, there are tears involved because people are going deep and they're sharing their fears, but also their hopes for the world. And this last trip to Alaska, for example, we interviewed a woman named Mary Peltola, who is running for Congress against Sarah Palin and another Republican candidate. She's an Alaska Native woman, grew up in a village fishing, and I asked her what salmon means to her, and she started crying. And that's, I didn't expect that. And because it's much more than food. It's about way of life. It's about tradition. It's about their grandparents and the way they were taught to smoke the fish all together at their family fish camps. And so always I'm surprised. We sit down. I think maybe it's going to go this way, and a kind of a new story emerges, and that's the beauty of it.
Is there one story that you've done over the years that you'd like to go back and revisit the people and do the story again?
That's a great question. I mean, I have been thinking this week that I would love to go back to Kentucky and see what happens in the aftermath of this flooding. Folks that I interviewed 4 or 5 years ago, they've lost their buildings. I interviewed a woman who bought a supermarket in a place where there's not fresh food easily found, and invested in it over many years. Energy efficiency, solar panels, all of that, and the building was destroyed. And there are a lot of people there who absolutely have a vision for Appalachia. And, it's a place that's misunderstood in our culture. It's a place that's often stereotyped, but there are remarkable people there and working really hard to create an economy that's fair and that's prosperous for people while respecting and caring for the land that they live on. And so, yeah, I would love to go back there and tell that story of how they recover from this flood.
Chris, where can people find your work? Do you have an archive online, or can people go and watch bits and pieces of some of the films that you've done?
Yeah, a lot of the work, not all of it, but a lot of it is at my website, which is christopherlandry.com. And in the next year, several pieces I think will be at film festivals. And they're mostly being used online by the clients, by people who are trying to get their story out.
Well, hopefully. How many film festivals have you taken film to at this point?
It hasn't been a big part of my work, but I would say a couple of dozen film festivals we've had work at, and we're probably submitting 2 or 3 films in the next year.
That's great. Chris, we're about out of time, but I want to thank you for joining me this morning. And maybe at some point you can come back and we can share some of the videos that you've done so people can get a better idea of the work that you do. And maybe in between that now and that time, you and I will finally get together and, our travels will be in the same place at the same time.
That's right. We need to have a nice coffee together and catch up.
We certainly do. We've been chatting with storyteller and filmmaker, videographer Chris Landry. And thank you for joining us. And we will be back with more On the Mark after we acknowledge our underwriters. Peter Coles is our chief engineer today. And if you liked today's program, want to share it with friends, or watch it again, this particular program will be archived on WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Barnes & Noble College Bookstore in the Ely Campus Center, offering Westfield State T-shirts, sweatshirts, and gift merchandise, all of your academic needs, and offering textbook materials in new, used, ebook, and rental formats. Available at the bookstore on campus or online at westfieldstate.bncollege.com.
Underwriting support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Greater Westfield Chamber of Commerce, the voice of business for the Greater Westfield communities. Informing, educating, advocating, the Chamber provides opportunities for members to make meaningful connections on local, regional, and state levels. For more information on the Chamber's many events, workshops, and programs, as well as the benefits of membership, visit westfieldbiz.org. The Chamber focuses on the most important economy, yours.
Hi, it's Bob Plass, and I have Wow, It's Tuesday, every Tuesday, 6 to 8. Wow, it's Tuesday.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
I did it!
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. And today we get a chance to chat with Fred Sokol, who is a colleague of mine. Fred was a longtime theater writer for the Springfield Republican and then went to Talking Broadway, where his reviews from regional theater in Western Mass and Connecticut and Broadway show up on an ongoing basis. He is a theater director, a theater teacher, a playwright, a screenwriter, and a novelist. And his newest work is called Silver Birch Summer, which just came out. And it's the story of a young girl who goes to a summer camp and kind of discovers who she is during the course of her summer. Fred, it's good to see you.
Hey, Mark. Very good to see you as well.
So when did this book come out, and how long did it take you to write it and get it into publication?
Well, a couple of stories there. I thought about it maybe 4 years ago, pre-COVID, and I actually read the first line of it at a public event, and people responded so well to it that I thought, I'm going to write this book. Very different stuff for me since, as you know, I've been writing these novels essentially about these old Jews running around. And this is an 18-year-old woman during the summer of 1965, very much a memory piece and a coming-of-age story. She grew up dribbling a basketball all over the place, and her hero was Bob Cousy. She grew up in the suburbs of New York. She watched Bob Cousy on black and white TV. And so what's become very precious to her is a Bob Cousy jersey that her mother sewed for her. And the story kind of goes on from there.
And this is a real departure from what you normally write, although this is set in the Catskills, if I remember correctly. And that's where a lot of people in your other novels probably would have hung out in the 50s and the 60s when it was the place to go to the resorts like Grossinger's or the Nevele or the Concord and all that. It's kind of a lost era in time. Did you go away to summer camp as a kid?
I went to summer camp after summer camp, and I loved every one of them. But, and I went actually to a lodge in the Catskills, and then I worked for one summer at another lodge in the Catskills, neither of which were as popular as Grossinger's or the Concord or Kutcher's or any of those. But these are more minor league lodges that I loved, and it's kind of a compilation of those two lodges where I set this particular story. And as you know, I wrote this within the voice of a young woman, so that's a departure. And you might ask, well, why and how did you ever think of doing that? And the answer is, here's a coupling and a connecting the dots of my various careers. As you know, I did a lot of theater on the college and community college level as a director and a producer. And, who really likes theater and participating during those circumstances but 18 to 20-year-old young women, the vast majority of whom were my clientele. And, for whatever reason, they came to confide in me. And I thought I had a good sense of that group, empathetic sense of goings on, likes, dislikes, romantic issues and so forth. So out of all of this came this kind of memory piece.
While you were writing this, you were continuing to do other things. I mean, how many shows a week do you review for Talking Broadway, for example?
Well, I mean, during the high season, which is now, it could be 3. It was even more for the Springfield newspapers, and it got to be wild and zany. I mean, I sometimes did 2 a day. I would go, back in that day, I would go to Stockbridge and I'd bring my basketball and take in a matinee, and then being myself, go find a hoop and shoot for a while and drive to Williamstown. It was insane. I mean, I'm not quite that insane now, but close to it. So right now I'm running all over the place and driving all over the place, and it's fun. And I wasn't sure during the whole COVID epic whether I'd want to resume, but I do. And then this is gonna lessen a bit as we move to early fall, where summer seasons are over and more few and far between plays or states that some of the theaters that in Connecticut.
Yeah, I actually took a good part of this summer off from reviewing and working and everything else, and went back last week to start reviewing. And my review calendar is just booked up between now and the end of the month, and then September's nice and light. So I'll get to be outside and enjoy the beginning of fall foliage and all that. What are some of the shows that you've seen this summer that have impacted you?
A whole host of them, beginning probably with Next to Normal way down in southern Connecticut at the Westport Playhouse. Wilson Germain Heredia was in that one. He was also recently up at Barrington Stage Company in a show they did. So certainly that. I mean, I love to walk in the woods with both Alan Burroughs and Johnny Epstein at Shakespeare and Company. And just the other night, I went to see Anne of Green Gables at the Goodspeed. I don't know if you've seen that or will see that or not.
No, I'm gonna miss Goodspeed. I'm hoping to go in the fall and see 42nd Street. But
Yeah,
when Anne of Green Gables opened, I was away from work, so
really,
I missed it.
it's amazing. It has this young star who's kind of torch singing her way through the show, which is, I would say, imperfect at this point. Some of the transitioning from the telling to the tunes needs a little more work, but it is a new show. And she and the cast are pretty spectacular and sensational. So I've been very fortunate. I've seen a lot of good plays both in the Berkshires and in Connecticut since June. And yeah, and at the same time, one of your initial questions was, how did this book come to pass physically? Well, that's a story unto itself, because Bella Storia Press, Linda Cardillo and friends operated and were intending to publish this novel. And then they just decided to close shop, that they had had enough after 9 or 10 years of this. On the other hand, Linda said, well, I'm going to shepherd you through this to your own imprint. And so I've chosen the title of Anatevka Press. And anybody who loves musical theater like Mark Auerbach will recognize Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. And, actually, Anatevka came before the actual literal town of Anatevka in the Ukraine. And so, for a variety of reasons, I chose that. And then, with Linda's help and some other folks, I had to navigate my way to making a really professional product. And it was a little bit hair raising because I didn't know how to answer a lot of the questions. You have to do this, you have to do that. I'm very, very pleased with the product, which is, kind of sitting right behind me. People love this cover.
Yeah, the cover's
And,
gorgeous. Yeah.
yeah, and the back cover is very explanatory. So, I mean, it's a little bit like the ninth miracle or something that that this thing has come to pass. I'm thrilled with it, and I have a variety of appearances to try to promote this. I would say I'm a so-so promoter. Um, I hope a little better writer than a promoter. I try, you know.
So I got to ask you, you've written plays and you've worked in theater directing plays for so many years, both on a professional level and with students and all of that. When you wrote this book and you write some of the other novels that you write, do you think of a play in mind, how it would work on the stage, or do you completely switch course and write it without thinking of the theatricality of your story?
Very good question. Very good, multifaceted question. Everybody thinks I'm a dialogue writer. And a lot of people think, including our very close mutual dear friend, Kate McGuire, that I'm writing movies. It's a huge leap. And I'm going to get back to your question about plays, but it's a huge leap from novel writing to films. Nevertheless, my good friend Andrew Silver, who is an independent filmmaker, and I, knew Andrew ages ago, read my first novel, and he said, this is a potential movie. Write the screenplay and send it to Dustin Hoffman. Well, I don't really know how. Everybody says you can write a screenplay. I'm not sure that I can. So as a dialogue writer, I'm always thinking, as I write these novels, am I a novelist or a playwright or both? In fact, a novel I'm working on right now, I began on two tracks, one writing the play version and the other writing the novel version. And I think it's a novel. I, as a strong dialogue writer, one wonders. I mean, I'm actually reading the novel version of The Graduate right now, and I find that it's 90 something percent dialogue. I mean, it's really the film. So
Was
it's all
was
in,
was the novel of The Graduate based on the film, or did it come first?
novel came first,
Oh, okay.
then the film. I just happen to have, me and you going to old, places where they have these books, and this one kind of just leapt out at me. I've got to have this, and I'm looking around and reading it, and it's very. I think I haven't read that much of it, but they adapted it very closely to the novel. So, here I am at this age, at this point in time, trying to figure out who I am in terms of, you know, where are my talents. I am glad to be doing this because early on, a few people said, you're a writer, and your play reviewing is great, but you're a creative writer. So get to it. As you know, I had many responsibilities as a dad and a husband and everything else that I did in multi careers. I just didn't have the space. I didn't
Yeah.
have the time to do this, the headspace, and you really need it. It's hard. I have a great editor, by the way, if you want to know about that. But yeah.
No, it's a very difficult thing, and I mean, I've sat down. I do a lot of writing, likewise with reviews and radio and stuff like that. But I've sat down. There's some stories that I want to tell, and I keep thinking I should sit down and write them, but I need the motivation, and I may start out with motivation, and then other things get in the way, and I oftentimes don't finish a lot of the things that I set out to do. So, to me, anybody who can plan a book in their mind and sit down and actually put it on the page, or a play to put it on the stage, I'm in awe because I don't have that kind of self-discipline necessarily to make it happen.
Well, I can do that, but then I was pretending for a while that I was finished after several drafts. And that's where the excellent editor kind of came into play, who said, have like 1,000 questions and comments, or maybe even more than that. And one is forced to respond. And I would say, between 75 to 90% of the time, I unfortunately agreed with her. So that meant that whether it was a period or an apostrophe, or whether it was a comment, sometimes I get a little off track with my time sequencing. I have something happen and then should say, like, you cannot have it happen then. That's impossible given the way you've structured this thing. So she's never rewriting anything that I've done, but extremely constructive with her criticism and recommendation in that regard. And so that, yeah, I mean, I think I can wash my hands of this thing, and it's fun writing the actual novel. And then it's like, then the work really begins. And I know that, in Michener's case, for example, it was said that his editor actually rewrote all of his work. I don't know, whether there's any veracity to that at all. But, yeah.
When you write, do you write on a computer or do you write on a legal pad like you see in the movies? How do you put your thoughts to paper?
I write either on my tablet, as we're doing this right now, or on my iMac, either one. I do not write longhand. I do know people who do. And I remember that when I've interviewed years and years ago, obviously, the poet Richard Wilbur, he had one of the really old, like early part of the 20th century typewriters. And he would bang away on that and write. I don't do legal pads. I do either my tablet right here or my computer. Yeah.
So,
and I have multiple projects going. Yeah.
Yeah. How many projects do you have going, aside from the reviewing? How many writing projects do you have going at one time? Can you stop one and pick up another one, or do you have to focus on one beginning to end?
No, I have multiple things going, and in fact, some people think this is the strength of my life, and some people think it's not a weakness, but makes things difficult. I've always been this way. I've always had a lot of irons in the fire and a lot of burners burning at once. So, for example, with this book, with Silver Bird Summer, which takes place when April was 18 years of age, I started a sequel, and it's tentatively entitled April at 70. And so I've jumped, like 52 years. And then I'm going backwards, saying, like, Fred, you can't do that. How much really is there to say? So I have that project. I have a much longer and more complex novel than I've ever done, which is getting to its conclusion. I'm trying to figure out the ending. And that particular novel spans from Moab in Utah to the Lower East Side in 1970. So it's all over the place. And I'm sure when my editor gets to this one that we're going to really have a picnic. My work it's going to even get worse. And I'm working on some plays as well. So, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so you're a busy guy. When you wrote this play, wrote this book, which is set in the Catskills, yeah, and you spent time in the Catskills as a kid and a young adult, did you go back? And the reason I ask is about 7 or 8 years ago, the Yiddish Book Center did a photographic exhibit of what happened to these grand resorts, like Grossinger's and the Nevele and the Concord, that are all gone now. But they did this retrospective, and they went into whatever the buildings were still standing. And I remembered this, I believe it was the resort, the Nevele, and the photograph of the swimming pool with the weeds growing out of it, and it had been abandoned for years. Did you go back to the Catskills to kind of soak up the atmosphere, or was it more of a memory type of thing for you?
Well, at this point, it's a memory kind of thing. I intend to go back, and I tend to go back particularly to one place because the sequel, which is, again, tentatively April at 70, is set there. And the place still exists, although I know different owners have bought it and turned it a little bit into kind of a evidently fine tennis place as well. It specializes in tennis, but it's still a lodge. So I intend to go back, but memory piece, yes. And in fact, an early reader said, in certain ways, this feels a little like Glass Menagerie. I mean, obviously not in all ways, but in terms of the memory effect of it. And I'll take that if it evokes that in anybody, sure.
Okay, Fred, we're going to take a quick break to acknowledge our underwriters that make On the Mark possible here. And just to let people know that you can find Fred's book, Silver Birch Summer, and some of his other books, Destiny, Mendel and Morris, and a script, The Forever Boys, The Lewis Sisters, and all of that. You can find them at wherever you get your books, online or through your independent booksellers. Peter Coles is our chief engineer today. I'm Mark Auerbach, and we'll return after these messages.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield. Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield.
I'm Mark Auerbach. Join me every Friday at 8 a.m. for Arts Beat, where you'll meet interesting actors, directors, designers, and musicians here in Western New England.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer today. If you've missed part of today's program, or you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, it's archived on YouTube under WSKB Community Radio. And you can also look at the archives, which I did not too long ago, and catch a lot of the other interviews that we've done for On the Mark and What Young People Think and Athenaeum Spotlight and Arts Beat are all archived there. So Fred has been on this program before. You can probably go through and search and see what Fred and I talked about the last time he was on this program. And Fred, of course, will be back when he writes another book or film or script and all that. So you can get the complete history of chat with Mark Auerbach and Fred Sokol on that YouTube page. Fred, with this Days of Summer waning and you're going out to promote this book, a lot of people ask, in order to get a book sold, you have to go out there and do a lot of readings and book signings and things like that. Are you going to be appearing around and in the Valley in the next month or so?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I'm appearing Wednesday night, the 17th, which is a week from tonight, actually, at the Storrs Library in Longmeadow at 6:30. And I'm appearing again at some of the senior centers in the area. I'm not sure of the exact dates, but both in Longmeadow and East Longmeadow in September. And I believe I'm going to have one or two other events as well, all in the Western Mass, Northern Connecticut area. I had one at the Enfield Library last week that went extremely well. It was kind of a kickoff and launch event. And frankly, Enfield is a little bit a home away from home for me, having worked for 31 years at Asnuntuck Community College in Enfield, which is, about a mile and a half from that library. And in fact, the interface, if you'll permit me, Mark, that I am writing some plays as well at the moment. And Asnuntuck is celebrating in the fall and next year its 50th anniversary. And we might be doing a 2-person play that I've written with 2 of my alum students who are theater students. So that's how I kind of interface my lives as a writer and as a theater director and as somebody who taught both at Asnuntuck and then at AIC and then the Bay Path as well, all those different places. But so to answer your question directly, one does have to hop around, make as many appearances, and try to aggressively get those appearances. Some people are more amenable than others. Libraries and senior centers and places like JCC are friendly to me in that regard. I'm trying to get some more. It's hard.
Yeah. Do you have a website that people can go to, or do you have a presence on social media that people could look you up if they wanted more information?
FredSokol.com website, and I could use some professional help in maintaining that website way better, but it does exist, and my work is posted there, and not as bad as trying to self-publish the book or professionally do Anatevka Press, but I do have the website, and people are saying, Fred, you've got to be better at that, and I try to slip through that crack, and I don't.
With the new press that you founded, Anatevka Press, and will you be just using Anatevka to publish your works, or will you be publishing other authors as well?
Well, it was originally devised for my own work, but I don't see any reason why I would not publish someone else's work using it. It's such a handsome job that people kind of did with this. You can see the end, not the. I'm blocking out the wrong thing here.
Yeah,
you can see it very beautifully done, very professional. So yeah, I welcome other people. I'm not yet adept at doing that kind of thing, and I imagine that I'll do some of my own work and on this in the future, and also explore other publishers as well. We'll see.
So at this point, you don't expect to adapt this new book to a play or a film, but if somebody else wanted to adapt it, would you be open to seeing it on the screen?
I want somebody else to adapt this, and Destiny and Mendel and Morris. I was looking, and people were quoting me huge fees for the screen adaptation, and no guarantee, of course. So, I kind of dodged that. I'm not connected to people who could take this novel or any of my other work and make the adaptation. I actually believe it would work, and I believe my friends such as Kate McGuire and Andrew Silver, who have said, you're very visual. You've got to get these things on the screen. So yeah, all suggestions welcome. Yes.
That's great. Well, Fred, we're just about out of time, but one of the things I was hoping is that we would run into each other at theaters up and coming, but what are some of the plays you're going to be reviewing in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I'm not entirely certain. I'm going to, what am I going to? I'm going to a little night music shortly at Barrington Stage. I'm going to Seascapes in the Berkshires that our mutual friend Eric Hill is directing. I might be going to Westport to see 400 Miles. I'm not really sure of that. And I would like to get to the Chester play with Tara Franklin in it, but you're going to probably get to that one. I don't know.
Actually, I'm only reviewing going into the fall at the most one play a week. So I am going to a little night music. I have decided that I want to review Waiting for Godot at Barrington Stage because as a theater student, as somebody who's worked in the theater for decades, I've read the script, but I can't ever remember seeing the play. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I maybe I have, maybe I haven't, but it's a classic that I really want to participate in. And I loved Secondo at TheaterWorks in Hartford, which is running through the end of the month. So we are both really lucky as theater reporters to be able to have such a vast resource of great theater in our backyards.
Well, Mark, as people have said to me, tough job, somebody's got to do it, right?
Exactly.
Really?
Well, we've been chatting with Fred Sokol, the playwright, the author, the theater critic. His new book is called Silver Birch Summer. It's out right now wherever you go to find your books, in person or online. And this wraps up another edition of On the Mark. Ending today's program with a little snippet of music by Stephen Sondheim called Perpetual Anticipation. It's from the musical A Little Night Music, which is currently at Barrington Stage Company. And the theme that I chose for our opening segments here on the Mark is Charity's theme from the 1966 musical Sweet Charity with music by Cy Coleman. Peter Coles has been our chief engineer today. I'm Mark Auerbach. We'll see you next week with another edition of On the Mark.
Perpetual anticipation is good for the soul, but it's bad for the heart. It's very good for practicing self-control. It's very good for morals, but bad for moral. It's very good. It can't be too boring. It's quite bad. It's very good for business. It's bad for the heart. It's very good to pay. Some delicate part, taking to start, keeping control while falling apart. Perpetual anticipation is good, but it's bad for the heart.